Hello everyone, I am Palpatine 001, aka the Senate, and we are back with Cities Skylines 2 and Manukau Ranges, part 1.2.0, Zones. Yes, the zones, aka what you can and you can't do with your lands, as it says quite clearly here in the game. Zoning determines what kind of buildings are allowed to be built and where they are assigned to roads and divided into their different types. So with this, we are going to be looking at, we're going to break up 1.2 into four subparts. So 1.2.0, which is this one here, we will be looking at the methodology of the zones and why, and we will touch briefly on, oh yes, those standardized zones in Japan, which follow their Land Use Act 1974, which basically dictates, as it says over here, and as I showed earlier, what gives a basic framework on what you can and cannot do with your land. It does not determine things like parking ratios or what the building does, or the solid as that. For Japan, that's the Building Standard Act. For the game, we actually have something else in play for this. It's done behind the scenes, but it can be done on the scenes. It can either be done through a zoning bylaw, in which I can set up all this, and I can get very pedantic, which is much like New Zealand's planning system. Or we can shoot back here and just go at a more grand level, and this would be, and I'm going to take a bit of a punt, this would be more like the Japan system, the Building Standard Act. So the zone being determined what the land use is, but what you can exactly put on it would be more controlled here. And so again, in Japan, this would be the Building Standard Act, which separates it out. In New Zealand planning, this is actually put together, and somewhat blends with the Building Act. So think of this as more as the building code side. So with residential, the average floor height, floor space, elevators, blah 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 blah. So we go to commercial, floor height, square meters per worker, blah 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 again. Industry, office, city services, which at the moment is currently enabled. Schools is also enabled, and this is just basically what happens if you in this case, what happens if you have a homeless person? Do they find a new home via the welfare centre, or do they sod off out of the city? Parking wise, this is more controlled up here, so you can do it two ways. With planning, you can either control it through your zones, so that will be minimum parking requirements, which are basically deleted in New Zealand, and I believe they're deleted in Japan, and they're slowly being deleted city by city, state by state in the States. Here, the zones, so if I was to shoot back over to the zones, again, so the zones follow again the Japanese system. The zones don't control any of those things that I have mentioned up here. They don't control all of that. That's just done behind the scenes. And it's done to the building. Whereas in this case, it's basically through the mods, which is done again through the building side. So I do have parking minimums on. I could technically also turn this off. Oh, it just syncs back to vanilla. So there's basically different ways that what is then built on the zone will play out. So basically, that's what happens there with the zones, and then when you bring in your building code along over the top. So at 1.20, basically I've just covered a small background in that, and I will dive into the zones a little bit more and their comparison with, again, standardized zone sent to Japan and has been brought into New Zealand. In 1.21, we will be basically doing the basic networks. So what I mean by basic is, as you can see here, we've got the main roads and that set out, but you'll notice the local roads and that are not yet set out. So when it comes to the local network, or some of the local roads are, an example would be, here we go here. So when we do this in 1.21, we do the basic network. So basically what I'll do is just show you a quick example. So I'll just use one of the network roads. Let's bring this up. Just a minute. So this is for industrial. Might be a bit of a poor example of that for industrial. In fact, industrial is going to be a poor example, but I can show quickly. So set the grid pattern. Set it up like that. So this is going to be okay. So the local road is set. Let me just finish that off quickly. That just brings that out because that's going to connect. In fact, I can actually do it now. Swim. Okay, so that's the local network set out, and then that just sets you up for placing down the zone. Now, interestingly enough, I've pulled in two new zones, warehousing and clean industry, when I don't need dirty industry floating around. So which way is that floating? Floating out there, floating out to the farm, so it doesn't matter. Standard industry will do. So this will be then covered in 1.2.2 is then when I go and example for placing the zones. And then in 1.23 we'll be covering things like the civic infrastructure, in this case education. So if we were to look at, let me actually see if I've got any, it's not all set up, well, not exactly well yet. Oh, it could be an example over here. So if I was just to do this real quick, and the one I like using for residential is what's it going to be there? Medium density. Actually, no. The one I like using is that one. So I'll show you what you do with civic. Actually, no, if I this is just showing you a quick run through. Okay, and let me just finish that off quickly with a small roundabout there that stays put. So basically what I've just done is 1.21, we'll cover that, is the basic road layout. 1.2 is the zones, so in this case drop to residential. What gives us the words? What civic infrastructure have I dropped in here? UK. So then the UK placement will be come down into here, and basically because it is in such close proximity, although not quite, that can actually be kept. Okay, so that's the zone placement 1.2, and then 1.23, just make sure I haven't already dropped one. No, I haven't, would be then placing down your education facilities. and as well as your green, that's not green infrastructure, as well as your green infrastructure. So we would go to large. Nice to know. And in this case, I would pull dog activity park. I might slap that in a minute. Where is it? Ha! Good to note. I might actually shove that one in. Shoving in your green infrastructure. So this one is one of the new ones. Do. And a petting zoo. Hey. Oh, I think that's got a path going out too. You can hear them. Sweet. So that would be 1.2.3. So just again, 1.2.0, which is this video, which we'll finally get into 10 minutes later. The methodology, 1.2.1, basic laying out your basic networks. As you see here with industry there, residential there, and also later on commercial. 1.22, slapping in those zones. Gotta slap the zones in, and congratulations, we've actually just laid our first zones. And then 1.23, following up with the civic, which in this case is actually educational, and green infrastructure, which is in the case of the parks. What's this? Yeah, this is a line from the classrooms. So that's what we'll be doing in the 1.2 series. So, methodology. As I had mentioned earlier in the piece, zoning is basically there for your land use. As the game so eloquently puts it, zoning determines what kind of buildings are allowed to be built and where. Zones can be assigned next to roads, and they are divided into their different categories. Here, different categories are typically residential, commercial, and industry. Now, for the sake of the game, office is separated out. In most planning, it is not. It's usually blended with commercial, and then planning commercial can come down two sides. It can go down what's called single use, so commercial, retail, and service is separated out from commercial office. So that's technically the old SimCity 4 style that we used to have. And then you can come down the mixed use side with commercial, which become planning is your centre zones, city centre, metropolitan centres, town centres, local centres, neighbourhood centres, or just plain mixed use if it's outside one of those. So the zones basically control the land use, and well, in most cases, that is pretty much it. However, in some cases, it can also control how the buildings are done, how much parking you need, and right down to what colour front door you can have and colour the building should be. Not quite how I would cover zoning. I would cover zoning again mainly in the land use. If I was to wanting to dictate what the buildings looked like, that can be done again through some basic standards, through parking minimums, and again through some basic building controls. But again, this in Japan, it's done through their Building Standard Act, which is separate from their Land Use Act, which controls the zones. Our Building Act in New Zealand technically takes care of these base parts. And in Japan, again, you take a look at their standardized zones, and you can see how it basically just tells you, like Cities Skylines, what has been determined where. Not how it will be, just basically the what rather than the how. Again, if I wanted to get down into the absolutely nitty gritty, this is where this would come in. And this, while it can be controlled through the zones, it really shouldn't be. It should be left, this kind of stuff should be left alone. Let your building code control it, rather than the zones. So, operating on the premise of standardized zones in Cities Skylines, let's knuckle down into the methodology that I will begin to use, or I have always used from SimCity 4 all the way to Cities Skylines 1, right through to Cities Skylines 2, and how I do it. But before we do that, basically, before we touch the zones, we'll go back up a level and look at spatial plans. Spatial plans are basically the highest level of planning you can do, well, usually done, and that's using your planning instruments to influence spatial form through behaviour and vice versa. So basically, when I do this in my head. In New Zealand planning, this is done on paper, PDF, and basically I'm mapping out areas on what I would like the area to be and how I'm going to influence it later through the transport network and through later on the zones. The zones then become the policy end, which in real life I'm a policy planner, and in my work profession outside that I also engage in spatial planning. So once you've done your spatial planning to outline, and which will also include the outline of the roads and what you would, transportation network, and basically an idea of what your zones, where you would like your zones to influence behaviour and spatial form. We then come out of the spatial plan and then we knuckle down to policy level, which is where this is where you'll see it in play. So again, spatial planning in City Skylines I do in my head. In real life I actually do as part of my profession. But my actual job description is actually a policy planner or senior policy planner. So I knuckle down into the actual zones themselves and what they do, because this is going to determine, and I should be also giving weight to our spatial plans, and soon it will be law in New Zealand that I've got to give weight. So the zones are basically the business end. They are the control form. Again, in City Skylines we have 4 basic zones, and the specialised industry is technically a part of the general industry, part of industry as a whole. It's a subset out. But for all intents and purposes, you have your 4 zones. Basic, and they're standardised. So no matter if I do it in this city, in this region, in another one, and this is my 4th City Skyline city, they are all the same. So if you were a developer wanting to come into this city and you want to build some industry, you want to build your factory in that, it's the same. Workshop, factories, warehouses, and storage sites. I'm not going to tell you the setbacks, I'm not going to tell you your building heights. I will tell you your floor area, which was up in the mod, and I might set a minimum parking requirement, usually depending on what. If I haven't, you're just going to remember that on-street parking I do charge for, and I can provide off-street parking at a cost. Case in point, right here, and if I was to boil it down, it's $20 a day to park on the road. But the zones is again where the business end is. So if we look at residential, and I just go through them quickly. Depending, you've got to remember, I've got the urban content pack in here, so this is just going to change the architecture flair. But the behaviour of the zone, regardless of the architecture or the urban content, still boils down to its most base part, which is which is demonstrated in the European and North American sets, which I'll bring up. So low density is that. Single and semi-detached. If I was to jump to the UK, that's detached, and let's just turn that on so I know what I'm doing. And semi-detached. We then move into the low order, medium density, which is can be your row houses, and they do show up in the other content packs, and the urban content packs. So your urban, this again is sometimes this will differ a little bit. So you can either have row houses or terraced. Works the same way. 2 to 3 stories. This is your low water stuff. We then move up into true medium density, as seen here. Just gonna make sure to, yep. So this is where you get your small style apartment buildings. And that is typically can be 3 stories. That would be your lowest. Although this is again, and for the sake of argument, in this game, this is done by the row housing and the terraced housing. So we're looking at 4 stories to typically 8 stories. So this is all your mid-rise stuff. And of course, again, your architecture can change. Now you just got to be careful a little bit, because sometimes they can go a little bit higher. So UK, if you push it up to about the 12-story limit for medium density. But also at the same time, what is introduced in this form of density is, and my favorite type of zone, mixed use starts kicking in. Now most of your mixed use is between 3 and 8 stories, depending ironically on which of these ones I pick. So if I pick the standard, they are often up to 8 stories. So your mixed use starts showing up. Same with the German, French and UK. Your Eastern European is actually, and Southwestern is actually a bit smaller. Northeastern pushes up as well. So your mixed use comes in, and then when you look at the Chinese set, it changes again. Once we go beyond mixed use, it deviates a little bit. So let's push on. We now have we're now starting to push into the high density. Now this can come in 2 forms. This can either be the low density housing, so this is your affordable housing. So this shows up for Europe. It shows up in China as well as the French, and Eastern European, I believe, does it as well. So just shoot back. Yep, there it is there. So you get your low rent housing, and then you start moving into your high density stuff, which is your big apartment blocks. The tallest sets are North America and of course China. Northeast is actually not that far behind either. So yeah, you push into your high density. So that's off the residential side. Commercials basically is boiled down into 2 forms, low or high. So yeah, low density, and then there's some different flares, and then your high density. Industry I'll come back to, because that's I've got a mod in play, but it's covered in 2 different directions. And then you've got your office, which is again is low density, high density, so that's your big stuff. China's your very big stuff. And then some medium, the French ones are actually medium density, so that actually acts as a good comeback. Northeastern bridges the gap as well. Industry, okay. Typically with industry, you usually have light industry and heavy industry, or light, medium, heavy, depending where. Most cases in New Zealand, it's light and heavy with a general business zone to act as the blend. And in the Japan style, that general blend shows up in the quasi-industrial and in their commercial zones. In Cities Skylines, have you ever only done one? It was just a general industry, and then you went out into your specialized industry. Now, what the specialized industry is, so you've got livestock, grain, vegetable, textile, forestry, stone, coal, oil and ore. Okay, so in the New Zealand context, that will be a heavy industrial zone with one of the and then you've got an extractive industry in place. That will have an overlay sitting over the top, although in some cases you can also have a special zone like a quarry zone. So, similar principle. Now, what I've done is a mod's come down called the Clean Industrial Zones, which allows me to delineate the industry out a bit. because we all wish we had a warehouse zoning. That's now been obliged, and I'll show you where I can stick this, because you got to remember it goes raw resources, so primary industry, to manufacturing, which is secondary, then it goes out to the commercial, and you need warehouses, which is your tertiary, to store it along those steps of the way. Now the warehousing in the main industry is pretty fine, but I can't get it near the commercial zones because I might risk a polluting factory shooting up, and yeah, so that can cause problems. With this new mod, I now have 2 new zones that can help out. So I have, again, the clean warehouse zone, which would be an absolutely perfect zone. This is the cargo terminal to bring in goods for the city centre, because a lot of high density commercial. So this would be a perfect zone right here to help store cargo before it goes out. It also can be placed next to the extractive industries as well, to act as an intermediary point before it gets shipped off to the factories. The other zone we've got is the clean one here, so I can bring this closer to the city as well. So I could drop this technically in well, I'll just use this as a crash course example in here, and I wouldn't have to worry about the pollution blowing over. So those are your zones here, and again, your specialized industries. Some of them, normal planning, again, will show up as an overlay over a heavy industrial zone. Others might show up as a special purpose zone, like a quarry zone. Most of your rurals, most of this would have its own. These ones would have their own zones as the rural zones, whether it's production mixed or whatever. So it just does that all in one neat little package. So that's the basis of the zone there. So from the policy side, start laying these down to control the ultimate form. Remember that I've got to give effect to the spatial plan, which in this case is always done in my head, but in reality is done on paper. Which then comes down to, and yes, I can hear you, fellow caller, fellow listener, and fellow viewer. You've talked about the methodology. You've talked about the spatial plans and policy level, wonk level. How does this impact you when laying down the zones? In the end, what's your methodology to carry out your spatial plan? Well, I'm glad you asked. My planning style follows what's called a composite urban model. So the urban composite model is C, and basically you have your core, but you have little mini cores floating around. And what basically happens there is, in terms of city layout, whoops, come back in, is the way I do it is I will establish a city centre or two. I will then, so we can see here, I will establish the first industrial complex, which we can see in here. And I might put some supporting stuff around it to get it going, because the city centre won't take off into full flight for a little while yet. And then I will establish what are called metropolitan centres, or 2-tier, the second tier down, and then you start getting your urban form filling in between. Basically what I mean is I will follow also the transit orientated development models. So where you've got stations and that showing up will often attract the relevant highest form of density, both commercial and residential, around it. And that's not always specifically high density. It might drop it back to medium density as the highest order. And then as you move out, you start dropping down to your mixed use, dedicated mixed use, and then you stop dropping down to your single use and your lower densities. And then of course it's all connected up with the road and rail networks to move people and goods, especially with industry having to move the goods across. So once those centres are pretty much in position, then it's basically joining the pieces of the puzzle together with the lower order zones. So technically when we kick off and we start doing the zone layment, we'll actually be kicking off in here in the Worry super part, as well as a bit out here to start here, because you start with your industry, then your residential, then your commercial, which is how basically cities come along, because you're tapping into the resources that need to be extracted, that need to be manufactured, and then that need to be shipped out. And then you need the workers to make that happen, and then you need the commercial to service those workers in the industry after that. Pretty much straightforward. If you try and go the opposite direction, I guarantee it will fail. Or it's going to stagnate for an exceedingly long time, and we do have an example of this in Auckland. I'm not going to name it, Westgate, compared to one that is actually thriving, Manukau. So that's the methodology I use, the composite model, so more than one city centre backed up by metropolitan centres. I will focus it in transit orientated development form, or TOD for short, and around each of those stations will be the highest order density that I decide to apply. It mightn't always be high, remember, it might be medium density. And then from there, we fill in with the lower order stuff as we move out and start connecting all those little centres up together to form one big urban metropolis, in some cases, a megapolis. And I'm just remembering, have I done one in, I have done in CS1, I've done one in CS2. That would have been Cape Slayer, would have been the closest. And also at the same time, you'll find that your higher order density also follow the corridors as well, because that's where you're often attracting things like subway stations and bus stops, and tram stops. So that is my layout methodology, so you'll get to see it in play, especially in 1.2, and you'll see it probably in 3.0 as the city continues to evolve. Now looking at the geography, it can't be all one big urban mass, so the island form is going to show up quite significantly this time. So this is quite a forced composite model, as you would. But in places like through here, this will connect, and out here, this will connect as well. Excuse me. Yeah, it's all flat terrain, so this will be one big conglomerate mass as well. So that's the layout I use. So in recap, yeah, not much action today apart from the two pieces I've just dropped. 1.2.0, which is this video, I've looked at, I should rather say, the methodology, which also includes my methodology, the spatial plan at spatial plan level, policy level, and layout level. In the next video, 1.21, we will do the basic networks which connect up to the arterial networks. So you can see it as an example here with industry, and you can see it in the case here with residential. So you get to see the basic networks starting to lay out as we start getting the city off the ground. 1.22 is when we actually start laying the physical zones. And no, not quite here. So as you can see, I put some industry in here, and I put some in this case because this is going to be a UK flavour. I had put in some low density terraced housing here, and also some semi-detached housing here, because this is following Volchoria Map is following a UK style of flair. And then 1.23 we start doing the last of the civic infrastructure, so that's your schools, as well as your green infrastructure, which is your parks. We then take a quick scope back and make sure everything's fine, and then in 2.0 we let rip. So quite a bit of technical work goes on. I usually do a lot of this behind the scenes, but in starting a new city, I'll show you how it's done, at least in this part. And once we get 2.0 off the ground, a lot of this again will be done off screen, because it gets quite long. It can take me up to 2 to 3 hours to go through the basic setup, the zone placement, and the civic and green infrastructure. If I'm needing to add in arterial roads and rail lines and tram lines and all that, add another couple of hours on top of that. So it can get quite long just to produce a tiny amount of content to see the city developing, or to follow that bus or train going from point A to point B. Welcome to planning, everyone, and welcome to Cities Skylines, and welcome to Manukau Ranges. I am Palpatine 001, aka the Senate, and this is Manukau Ranges 1.2.0 the methodology. Next up, basic network and getting ready for the zone placement.